Hello and bonjour. I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter, and welcome to the session on Is This the End of Global Governance? We live at a time that is still governed by a system that was created in 1945 after World War II, when the great powers of the world were Britain, France, the United States, Russia, and China, the great powers or the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And over the intervening 80 years, we have seen that system grow, and we've added, of course, different institutions, but increasingly it is frayed. And there are new powers in the world, and there are many, many more nations in the world. 195 when the UN General Assembly Hall was created to hold only 60 nations. That's what people imagined in 1945 would be the biggest number that the international system would accommodate. So our question today is whether that system can continue to actually provide global governance. Is it the end of global governance? I am going to introduce our panelists. We will then have a conversation for about 50 minutes, and we will then turn to your questions. So I'm going to encourage you to put questions into the Q&A as we go so that I can then turn to them and ask them at the end. I would also encourage you to target your question to a specific panelist if you can. So I am delighted to introduce our panel. Our first panelist is Dino Pati Jalal, who is the founder of the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. Second, we have Mabel Yu Miao, who is the co-founder and Secretary General of the Center for China and Globalization in China. Welcome. Then we have Igor Jurgens, the chairman of the Institute for Contemporary Development in Russia. And finally, my old friend, I haven't seen him for a very long time, Celso Amorim, the former Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense. So welcome to you all. Let us begin. I'm going to start with my first question to Mr. Jalal. To strengthen North-South cooperation, what kind of engagement would ASEAN countries welcome, and what role do U.S.-China tensions play?
Oh, thank you, Anne-Marie. First, we would definitely welcome major powers to support what is called the ASEAN centrality. So this is the notion that in regional affairs in Southeast Asia, ASEAN as the organization should take the lead in driving change and events in our region. This is very important because in the past we felt like objects, right, rather than drivers of regional affairs. And it took us like 30, 40 years to be where we are now. And the main concept driving that is ASEAN centrality. So we would like the US, China, Russia, Japan, if they come into our region, that they would follow the ASEAN centrality. They would say to ASEAN, you're the driver, you're the convener, and we would be happy to follow your lead on this. Of course, this is something that has to be earned, right? But this is something that ASEAN feels very strongly about. Yeah? So that's one thing. On the U.S., there was a feeling that during the Trump era, the U.S. sort of lost the plot in Southeast Asia, right? This theme of America first was seen as a retraction from U.S. engagement or leadership in the region. And there was a great deal of disruption in the relations between the United States and Southeast Asia. As an example, I'm from Indonesia. There was sort of no visit at all during the Trump years from Trump to Indonesia and vice versa from my president to United States. And this is odd because this is a relationship between the second and third largest democracies in the world, right? So there was that element, but now the Biden administration is in place, and there's a lot of expectations on the United States. We expect the United States to be relevant to the problems that we have in the region, which is the pandemic crisis, the economic issue, the economic recovery, right? And many in Southeast Asia are not really interested in the strategic rivalries. We think it's the wrong time and the wrong place to have that at the moment. And there's a lot of expectations that the U.S. and China should try to get along, at least in our region. Maybe globally they're competing, but in our region, they should try to work out more schemes of cooperation. And to be perfectly honest, many of us in Southeast Asia don't understand why is it so difficult for the U.S. and China to cooperate on climate, right? And happily they just announced something in COP26 in Glasgow, or on the COVID-19, the vaccines issue. They're both still competing rather than working together, on economic rebound and so on, right? But just a last point on this, there's also a feeling that while we welcome the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy under the Biden administration, there's a feeling that the U.S. is lacking an economic plan for the Indo-Pacific, or for specifically also for Southeast Asia. The U.S. is out of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the largest trading bloc in the world. It's out of the CPTPP, right? And there's no economic plan of significance, regionally or bilaterally at the moment. So we hope that can be fixed. We are still waiting for bold economic plans from the United States with regard to Southeast Asia.
Thank you. And I want to point out that you raised several points that are critical as we think about the future of global governance. One is very much blocs like ASEAN, like the European Union, like the African Union, like the OAS, did not exist in 1945 and sit quite uncomfortably with the state-based system that we have. So you have great power, you have permanent members of the Security Council. And the second point you made is there's still an enormous amount of great power competition. Indeed, one place where the Biden administration and the Trump administration agree is that we've had a return to great power competition. And yet, from where many of us sit, what difference does it make if China or the United States wins if Indonesian's islands go under, right? Or if we all succumb to a global pandemic? So we also have a system in which we still privilege great power competition, and there are new great powers on the stage, but that comes at the cost of global action. So thank you for that. Now, my next question is to Mabel Yao, and it really builds on this, especially through the pandemic. Instead of an increase in international cooperation, which you might have expected, we've seen a retreat. Now, part of that is that the Trump administration wanted really no part of global cooperation and immediately pointed the finger at China for causing the pandemic and essentially making the tensions worse. But what we see more broadly in all countries is that populism and nationalism and protectionism in trade are on the rise. And so how do we then address these transnational challenges, or I would call them global challenges? If governments are becoming increasingly nationalist, who's going to speak for the globe?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anne. And it's my great pleasure to be here. And I love Paris Peace Forum very much. It's a good opportunity for global governance. This situation itself is a good place for our global governance, I think. Firstly, no country has actually retreated from international cooperation. Instead, many countries are trying to restore international cooperation by establishing and reviving various mechanisms, both regional and global. Like just now, we mentioned ASEAN countries, that is a kind of regional cooperation. No country can afford the loss by isolating itself from the international community. That is the reason we have seen so many efforts on data sharing, vaccination cooperation, and mutual recognition on vaccines in the pandemic. International cooperation has been functioning as before, although the level of cooperation went down because of prevailing, like you mentioned, the populism and the protectionism. But it is happy to see that many countries reopen its borders. Right now, transnational mobility restarts. China also held the annual International Import Expo in Shanghai in early November. It also applied to join more regional FTAs like CPTPP. China does not and cannot be kept away from the international community. I'm from China, so I hopefully we will see the world return to normal in the near future. Nowadays, challenges seemingly come from populism and protectionism, but actually originating from the mismatching between the current global governance and the changing reality. The rising of climate change, digital economy, imbalance of economy development, we need to find ways to deal with them. The global governance is falling behind the global practices. There's a gap between the current global system and the dynamic global challenging situations. Like you mentioned, 80 years ago, there's many organizations. There was not many organizations. So far, we have more and more international mechanisms. It's totally different from that time, but we're still operating under a kind of the similar terms. Well, we need to assert the necessity of international cooperation on one hand, keeping reforming the current system on the other. Building trust, I think, is very, very crucial. So the dialogue, communication, interaction, and the negotiations all are appropriate options taking us to address transnational challenges. No finger pointing, confrontation, and deterrence. I think there are some proposed from me for the paths lead to better global governance. I think the first one we should find solutions to repair global governance by encouraging more technology innovation. Technology development may bring latest solution to narrow the gaps. That is very important. Secondly, we need to stress sustainable development goals, SDGs, for a better environment and ecology to secure the future of the whole human being. The implementation of SDG will also help boost international cooperation as addressing climate change has become a common agenda for the international community. Thirdly, we need to put multilateralism as the most crucial principle for cooperation. So as to all countries and regions, despite the differences of their scales on territory, population, and resources, we have the equal right to participate in global agendas. The diversity and fairness of the global governance can only be secured with multilateralism. Although a global governance will survive, it may be partially replaced by regional cooperation mechanisms, such as the regional FTAs, like the CPTPP and RCEP. Regional integration is proved to be a more efficient way than global governance to overcome the imbalance of development while motivate the maximum potential of cooperation. Let's hope all regional cooperation mechanisms can be collaborated into one and inseparable system. Finally, I would like to propose that the WTO reform is quite important. It should continue. Of course, CPTPP is similar to like the small WTO, but we need more multilateral parties engaged. Maybe in the future, we propose the G7 can upgrade it to G10 plus India, China, and Russia, so we can continue our develop and innovate on new international mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. So I hear a number of themes again that are important for thinking about global governance as a whole. And as you said, there is this real mismatch between the United Nations of 1945 and the world of 2021. One of those questions, of course, though, is the reform of the Security Council and the expansion of permanent members, or the abolition of permanent members, or the abolition of the veto. And it is complicated then, because many of the powers who want greater global representation don't want to expand the permanent membership, which is always a tension. The other point, and I'm going to be turning to Igor Jurgens next, is the tension between regional blocs and global governance. On the one hand, I quite agree that the European Union, ASEAN, these are very important ways of solving problems regionally. But as Mr. Jurgens will certainly remember, many of us who grew up during the Cold War, the world was divided regionally. You had NATO and you had the Warsaw Pact, and that division, of course, spread more broadly. And many of us are very anxious to avoid a new Cold War. So to Mr. Jurgens, though, do you see similarities between current East-West tensions and the Cold War? And how do we prevent escalations and restore greater cooperation between the United States and Russia? And I would add more broadly, it's not the Cold War. Certainly with China, the United States and China are deeply interconnected economically in a way that the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia are not. But the United States and Russia have a whole set of different ways we interact. How do we push this forward rather than back?
Thank you very much, Anne. It's a great question. Yes, there are similarities, because definitely there are two blocks being built at the moment. One, put it this way, the block of those countries which believe in their indigenous authoritarian kind of ruling, and another block which is a traditional democratic bloc, one led by China, another one led by the United States. It's a fact of life, and there are a lot of similarities. And when and if, God forbid, something happens around Taiwan, for example, or around the Ukraine, or around some other issues, those blocs can mobilize, and then through unexpected consequences, we can face very serious situation. That's the similarity, but a total difference is that we're intertwined now, and we depend on each other to the extent impossible to imagine the Soviet Union and the United States standoff. Because at the moment we are governed globally. No matter what we say, no matter what our leaders are saying, the value-added chains, the rules according to which the global financial markets are ruled, and so on and so forth, all of this makes it impossible to visualize economic and ideological standoff the way the confrontation, the way we saw it during the Cold War. Partly I'm in the financial world in my country, and regardless of what United States and Russia are saying about their politics and about their confrontation, things like ESG, for example, things like the standards of accounting, things like transferring money. While we were talking with each other, I'm sure that about $60–70 billion exchange hands between Russia and the United States, between Russia and London Stock Exchange, and so on and so forth. That makes us together. That makes us within one system of global governance, no matter what our politicians are saying. But politics are very difficult, and politics will always be there. And in spite of the fact that, for example, at the moment, Russian government is very skeptical about multilateralism, in spite of the fact that Russian government at the moment, for the Russian government, the word globalization is a bad word. Nevertheless, younger generation people for whom the border is not at the airport, international airport of Moscow or whatever, but at the laptop in their kitchen or in their study, this young generation lives totally different world. They don't have these borders, and they manage to live without their governments. So my hope for the future, being a professor at one of the universities in Russia, my hope for the future is for this generation, which speaks English or French or Spanish. This generation doesn't care much about political differences. Yes, they know about the problems which we're facing on big issues of strategic armaments, limitation talks about Ukrainian situation, about Belarusian situation. They have their stance on it, but they live in totally different framework of togetherness. And Esperanto, the language which we remember at the beginning of the 20th century, we tried to invent for the world to communicate. English is now the Esperanto, and they all speak English. So it doesn't answer your question, but to answer the big question of our session, I would say that the globalization is there. It starts in a new form, and what makes it even more interesting. First industrial revolution did away with feudalism, with those people who worked under a lot of pressure on the ground, being subject to their landlords. This green revolution will do away with classical capitalism because it will be also a very big social revolution, this revolution which takes us from shareholding capitalism to stakeholders capitalism. And that makes a huge ground for discussion, and that makes our people together, thinking together in the same direction for years to come.
Thank you so much. I love the image of the borders of the world no longer being the airport or the actual physical border, but the laptop. I think that is exactly how our children see the world, and they start connected. My generation started separate. You were an American if you needed to get to Europe or Russia or China or Brazil. You had to get a passport, and you were one of a small number of people who did that. This generation starts connected to anyone, anywhere, and then has to figure it out from there. But also, as you say, is in the midst of an enormous technological change that enables that, and equally important, the planetary change. I do agree with you that there are larger forces than any state can control, and those forces are planetary, but as you also say, they are financial, they are cultural in ways that bind us together. So thank you for that. And before I turn to Minister Amorim, I also want to remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A. I see some excellent questions have been posed already. Keep going, and we will be able to turn to you toward the end of the hour. So thank you. So Minister Amorim, we live in interesting times in your country and mine. Jair Bolsonaro has transformed Brazil into a powerhouse of anti-globalism, much as the United States certainly was from 2016 to 2020, pushing nationalist sentiment and attacking the United Nations. And again, the United States has been through this same process, as have many European countries, but attacking the United Nations for undermining national sovereignty. In your point of view, and again, the Americans have been through this, how can countries that want to strengthen multilateralism, and I would say organizations that want to work together, How should we deal with nationalist leaders who systematically attack the international system and push that point of view on populations?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's a big pleasure being with you. I still remember your article in Financial Times when you said that maybe in relation to the Iranian nuclear program, maybe we should come back to the agreement that Turkey and Brazil had proposed. And the fact that
I did.
somehow it happened later on. But the fact that it was rejected first is a very clear indication of the difficulties to change the international system and the resistance of the existing permanent members of the Security Council to the participation of any other country. I just mentioned that because that has to do with your more general question. And if I may, just about your more general question, because we live after a moment of a great crisis, big crisis with the pandemic, I think what we did, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but sometimes you have to exaggerate to have your point through. What we need is some kind of new San Francisco or a new Versailles or Paris in order to look at the international order and to look into an order in which the main problems, of course, we continue having geopolitical problems the ways that you have already been mentioned, but we also have global problems which cannot be addressed regionally. I just mentioned that very clear. And I think this has to do with the question of global health. It has to do with the question of global warming, and it has to do with the problem of inequalities, not only north-south, but within countries and so on. So I think we need a new kind of international organization in which subjects of this kind cannot be held by veto. I mean, how can you deal with a question like global warming or with the vaccination in the geopolitical context of China and the United States? It's totally absurd. So we have to look at it with a new eye, with a new vision. And I think what I would, if I may, recommend world leaders to do is to have the political will to call for this. I don't know, the G20 may be a little bit changed you say that the G20 also has been somehow, it has its problems, but with some changes, a little more African and a little less European, maybe the G20 could, a little darker, it will help us into the right direction. But now to your question, I'll try to be very brief. Bolsonaro is not an isolated phenomenon. Of course, it's part of an extreme right movement that is all over the world. And it's a curious movement because it has different facets in each place. For instance, I don't think Bolsonaro is really a nationalist in any way. I mean, his first proposals in foreign policy is of total submission to Donald Trump. Total submission in a way that Brazil never had, even during the Cold War, even during So Bolsonaro, I believe, is, I don't know how to say it in English, but in Portuguese it's a point out of the curve. So Bolsonaro is a passing phenomenon. It will go away in Brazil because it doesn't represent, it's not the center right in Brazil, it's not a question of the left. Bolsonaro is really something totally contrary to all the traditions of Brazilian foreign policy, of Brazilian search in way or another for a more just society and so on. So I hope it will be there. Well, I think that what the international community can do about that is what it is doing already. Bolsonaro, I mean, the former foreign minister of Bolsonaro said that Brazil wants to be a pariah because it doesn't want to participate in globalism. Okay, so the international community is treating Bolsonaro as a pariah. So I think this will not last long. I don't want to go into specific politics now, but I think Brazil will come back to a more normal and rational discourse-based government. And in that context, we can help. You mentioned the OAS. I don't believe the OAS can be compared to other organizations because there are, of course, a big imbalance between the northern part and the rest, the United States and Canada, which are super developed countries, and the rest, which are underdeveloped countries. But anyway, some sort of integration of South America and in a fight for a more multipolar world in which you don't have just China versus the United States. Russia is a big power, of course, you all know about that militarily and in other respects. Europe is a big power in economic respects in terms of soft power. And I believe a joint South America, a joint Latin America maybe, can help, and Africa, of course, with other developing countries, can help in building this new world that we need, with a new organization which deals in an appropriate way with these global questions, which certainly the Security Council, because what happens nowadays, and I'll finish with that, it's because the Security Council is the most powerful body in the world. I live that. I'm not speaking theoretically. Every problem that appears, global warming, pandemics, well, let us, even Ebola, let us take to the Security Council. But it's a total, and now, of course, the COVID. It's a totally absurd thing because the Security Council you can understand, not accept maybe, but you can understand the veto if you have the question of Crimea or Hong Kong or Taiwan, or if something similar happens in the coast of the United States. But you cannot understand the veto in global questions which affect not only the security, but the well-being of the whole world. So I think we need deep reform that brings the world more to the solidarity and less to the egoistic and let us say egocentric views of these extreme right-wing movements, which are all over the world. And I'm very glad. Let me one final point. I think we need a new deal with the world. Biden was able to do have a new deal within the United States, but he didn't understand yet, maybe because of this obsession with China, he did not understand yet the kind of new deal we need for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, I note the overlap between your point and Mr. Jorgen's point of if we think about also the technological changes of what's happening in capitalism, a sense of stakeholder capitalism, or really even more a form of economics that is sustainable, that preserves the planet. And then you mentioned also the need for essentially a new San Francisco conference or a new Versailles conference, that we actually do need different ways of governing the world, many of which are already emerging, but very hard to recognize them within the current system. So there are 2 points, and I'm going to turn back to Mr. Jalal about region, but the 2 points are, we do see regional organizations emerging. Some indeed, as Minister Amorim said, are much stronger than others. The European Union is the strongest. ASEAN has grown tremendously and is really an organization of 650,000 people with a huge economic weight in the world. Parts of Africa, more than the AU as a whole, there are subparts. And again, I agree with you. I actually think Latin America, South and Central America are the weakest regionally, and perhaps because of the United States. But how can we build up strong regional organizations at the same time as we need to mobilize non-state actors? If you look at the SDGs, it's not going to be the states that are going to do all of that. It's going to be business, civic organizations, faith groups, universities, all the different powers in the world aside from governments. But so Mr. Jalal and we've got another round of questions. We need to be shorter on these so that we can make room for the questions from the audience. But this is a question about regional security. But to achieve energy security at home, Indonesia needs to administer the safety of the sea lanes along the Indo-Pacific. And so how do you think about multilateral cooperation within the Indo-Pacific? And I'm mindful of your point that, you know, when the US and China and other powers enter the area, they don't pay attention to ASEAN, to the region. And how do you think about what it would take to strengthen cooperation within the Indo-Pacific and then the larger North-South power imbalance?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And first, you raised the safety of sea lanes. And in my view, the world community signed the UN Convention on Law of the Sea in 1982. And to be honest, that convention has never become more important today, right? Because, some countries are behaving in contradiction with the Convention on Law of the Sea. So I think there's more at stake in making it more relevant and more applicable today, not just as a basis to resolve territorial and jurisdictional conflicts, but also as a basis to promote cooperation. So that's one thing. And I want to also respond to what you said about the global order. And, to be honest, and Marie, countries like Indonesia and many countries in the South believe there must be a rules-based global order, right? Absolutely, because without rules, there'll be anarchy, right? But also, to be perfectly honest, a lot of us feel that this rules-based global order, or what you call the liberal international order, whatever you call it, right, is full of inconsistencies, right? It's full of double standards, right? It's full of instances where countries call for it. Yeah, I'm talking many Western countries call for it, but when it's inconvenient for them to apply it, or when it bothers or it's against their interest, then they look the other way or they don't apply it, right? And this is really a source of frustrations to many countries who call for rules-based order and who want to believe in it because they just see there are just so many double standards and inconsistencies. And this brings to my next point, which is this is why a lot of countries rely more on regionalism and bilateral means to get things done. And to be honest, during the COVID-19 pandemic, yes, there's a lot of calls for international cooperation, but we see how that is not going well. Yeah, in WHO, in the UN, in COVAX, and so on, it's just so slow, right? And a lot of countries like Southeast Asian countries, we believe, okay, without waiting too much on the global process, let's get a regional solution. And on top of that, let's get a bilateral solution, which is faster and usually more effective. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has reinforced that sense, both of nationalism. Countries say we got to protect ourselves first, but a lot of those countries who say we got to protect ourselves first also realize they can't resolve the issues unless they get international cooperation, get more vaccines, more medical equipment, and so on. But at the same time, they also believe that, in my view, regionalism and bilateralism delivers more at the moment than multilateralism. Yeah, and unfortunately so. Yeah.
Thank you. And I take note of the point that the rules-based order is indeed riddled with double standards and contradictions, and again is just imbalanced because of the ways in which it's evolved. I often say, imagine if the world of 1945 were ruled by the international structures of 1845. And that's where we're going to be in 2045 unless we can figure out ways to change it. I would note there is also something I know you've noted, kind of intellectual arrogance often on the part of the global north in terms of the solutions that are coming from the global south. And so, Minister Amarim, I'm going to turn back to you and ask you to elaborate on what you would think about, say, in the region, whether that is northern South America or all of South America, but think about questions like protecting the Amazon, which is a global issue. Well, what happens in the Amazon affects us all. And yet, of course, it is also a Brazilian issue and the other countries in the Amazon basin in terms of development, in terms of being able to help to resolve your own problems. How would you think about protecting global assets from the point of view of a country that is deeply involved? And again, we talked about Bolsonaro, and I take your point that populism is by no means limited to the Brazil or the United States. And I take your point that may change, but for the moment, Bolsonaro has encouraged Brazilians to think to reject any kind of foreign investment or international cooperation on issues like the Amazon.
Well, Anne-Marie, it's not maybe adequate for me to say everything that I think about Bolsonaro in an international setting. But I don't think he's a valid interlocutor, just to say this a simple thing in simple words. He doesn't represent Brazil. He doesn't represent the majority. He was elected, all right, with fake news and all that, the same way as Trump was elected. Maybe in a bit worse way than Trump. So I take Bolsonaro out because I think with Bolsonaro there's no deal to be made. He's not reliable. He says one thing and does a different one. So I don't really think, but I think more structurally, I do think that Amazon, of course, is a Brazilian problem or a Colombian problem, other countries that are in the Amazon as well, but it's also a global problem. And I think you have to deal with this, let us say, ambiguity or with this duplicity of situations in the proper way. I mean, by having increased international cooperation, but which at the same time may be based as much as possible not on imposition, but on national projects. And that's what we were trying to do before. I mean, I don't want to go at length in history, but we had agreements, for instance, with Norway and Germany before, during the government that I served as foreign minister, in which Brazil decided the projects that it wished to do to protect the Amazon. And of course, then it submitted to our partners to see if they deserved international financing. And that's how it happened. So it was, in a way, it was a sovereign decision because we understand also that protecting the Amazon is fundamental for us. It's fundamental for our rivers, for our energy from waterfalls and so on. It's fundamental for not fundamental for the indigenous population. It's fundamental for everything. But at the same time, it requires international cooperation. So I think finding this balance and this equilibrium between national sovereign decisions and international cooperation, it's possible. It's not very simple, but it's possible. What happens is that people play with that in a very opportunistic way. As you mentioned, in the case of Bolsonaro, it was really something that he flagged to have the support of some of the right wings, including in the military sector, to have their support, and also to some other right wing. On the other hand, many other countries, instead of doing their job, instead of putting enough money in international cooperation, instead of assuming their own responsibility, just throw everything on the countries that have the problem. So, of course, Amazon is a global problem, the same way as the Arctic is a global problem, the same way as having nuclear weapons, which threatens us all, is a global problem. So, of course, these things have to be dealt at the same time globally and regionally. And that's why, and sovereign, and in a sovereign way. But also, and just to finish with this, my conclusion, I don't think there is any contradiction in having strong regional cooperation, as was mentioned by previous speaker, and at the same time not discounting the importance of the global cooperation. And in that respect, I want to again make a point. Of course, some of the things don't depend on our will and don't depend on specific decisions, but as much as possible, we should struggle to use Primakov's word, since we have a Russian here, to struggle for a multipolar world in which cooperation will be more adequate, and cooperation will be less at the service of this or that power. And I'm not referring to anyone. It may be any one of them. But in a multipolar world, which is somehow reflects itself in a multilateral system, I prefer to say multilateral rules instead of rules-based, because rules-based they can be created by anyone. So multilateral system, that's what we need. And that's why I think maybe having a new San Francisco is a bit exaggerated, but we need some input, some effort in order to reorganize our institutions, and all these problems have to be dealt adequately within these new structures.
Well, thank you. And I deeply agree. I do hope at least the Paris Peace Forum, which I note has peace prominently in the name, is at least an incubator for many of these ideas it won't be neat. It won't be one conference. It's impossible to think of that, but it's not impossible to think of building other structures alongside or indeed on top of the current structure that we have, that comes from places exactly like this one, with a much wider group of people participating. So Mr. Jurgens, I'm going to turn back to you, and then Ms. Miao, you will have the final question. We will be turning to the audience in 6 minutes. So Mr. Jurgens, I'm struck. First place, as Minister Amarim said, it's Minister Primakov who talked about a truly multipolar world. That doesn't just mean the United States and China, the United States and Russia. It really means different centers of power. But I'd love for you to elaborate on your idea of the young people being connected, the Russian young people, many of whom study in the United States and Europe and other continents. How do we strengthen those ties when our governments, so certainly Mr. Putin, but also again when it was Mr. Trump, are actively discouraging that kind of global interaction, are actively mobilizing nationalist sentiment and pointing the finger at the foreign enemy, which is a very old device for governments. How, again, from your point of view, from the financial markets, how do we turn that kind of connection into a source of multilateral power?
Excellent question again, and thank you very much. I would start with Macron's, the day before yesterday, he mentioned that nationalism is the betrayal of patriotism. And this is a good line, punchline, I would say. And those nationalists who still prevail in many countries, they really betray patriotism, because patriotism, which is the love for their country, is a beautiful feeling, whereas nationalism is xenophobic and makes patriotism look like something which is outdated. So I started with this. I would say that 80% of young Russians are very patriotic. 20, I would say, pretty cosmopolitic. All of them like their country. Russia is a beautiful land. And they are learning to live without authorities. Definitely many of them would depend on the state. Of course, they will depend on the fellowships, on the healthcare systems, on educational systems, but they manage, compared to my generation, and I'm going to be 70 next year, compared to my generation, they managed to live without the state in its everyday's sort of expressions. And why? Because economic situation is getting a little bit better. Compared to the Soviet Union, inequality is astounding, but economic efficiency and economic sustainability is much better. And by growing the middle class and by growing the opportunities for the young people to deal with their problems themselves, we will definitely manage sustainable development, global multilateral system, and regionalization. Russia is a philosophical motherland of anarchism. People like Bakunin and Kropotkin, they proved by their lives fighting against Marx that even if you are a Marxist and you impose the rules in the name of the majority, the pinnacle of this majority will be dictators. And only through anarchy, that is to say, in modern words, through regionalization, through good municipal governance, you can reach this bright, ideal world of equality, sustainability, solidarity, and so on and so forth. Technological developments will give us this opportunity sooner or later. We have some fantastic things. Of course, we have those gaps which Paris Peace Forum tries to deal between North and South, East and West, and so on and so forth. But we are living in the world where if you can allow yourself to buy something hydro and put it 15 meters below your house, you're absolutely independent in terms of heating. You're absolutely independent in terms of knowledge through your laptop. You can be independent very soon in terms of the speed of traveling, and so on and so forth. So that will give each and every new generation human being a lot more of opportunities to be independent. Being independent altogether is impossible because independence is interdependence between you and your neighbor, but that can be sort of reached through regionalization, municipal and local self-governments, and so on and so forth. So to sum it up, the state will always play a very serious role in equalizing chances between the rich and poor, between able and disabled. But with the technological breakthroughs we're living through, people of the younger generation, if well educated, they will manage much better than we without NATO, Warsaw Pact, without strategic nuclear arms, and so on and so forth. I understand that I'm overly optimistic and probably idealistic, but if you don't have an ideal, then it's very, very boring to live.
Thank you. And I share your ideal. I do believe that the answer is going to be much more going local and global away from national, but local is critically important. There are 7,000 mayors committed to fighting climate change. That's going to do a great deal, even more than governments. So Ms. Miao, I have one final question, but I'm going to ask you to be quick because we have a lot of great questions in the Q&A. And the question is, how can the United States and China not only agree to cut emissions as they did this week, and it was very important, but much more than that, challenge one another to lead a global competition or to spur a global competition on who can develop the cleanest technology, who can, in fact, find ways of making that green energy transition the fastest. In other words, a race to the top, not a kind of grudging, well, we'll cut this if you cut that, but much more, look, we have to have a global competition, and we are the two biggest emitters. We're going to agree to engage in that competition transparently. Is Ms. Miao still with us? I think we've, oh, there she is.
Yes,
Great.
I'm here. Sorry, I lost. Your signal is not good. Sorry. Sorry.
Could you hear my question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
You're still there. So my question was, how could the United States and China engage in a race to the top to compete in a way that is not just agreeing to cut emissions, but to challenge the whole rest of the world to who can make the green energy transition the fastest, who can create the cleanest technology the fastest? And just in a minute or two, if you will, because we're heading for the open question.
Yeah. The deal officially named China-US Joint Glasgow Declaration on Enhancing Climate Actions in 2020 signifies the consensus achieved between the two largest economies in the world, which will greatly improve international cooperation on climate change. It came from a wide disappointment when people started to believe the COP26 will end up without solution. So this kind of joint declaration happened. We are very happy to see that. The two sides agreed to establish a working group on enhancing climate actions in 2020. The two countries also agreed to cooperate closely during the next 10 years on a range of climate-related issues, including the methane emissions, fossil fuel reduction, and clean energy technologies. A substantial frame and concrete steps are set up for closer cooperation, which may lead to the funding of the permanent international mechanism for the international community and will bring enormous impact to future global governance. I think China already took the responsibility by implementing serious measures to cut emission while boosting international cooperation to address climate change. And China promised to the international community in 2020 to reach its emission peak by 2030 and realize carbon neutrality by 2060, which has been called the double carbon goals. It's a very popular policy in China. When I went to the counties in China, many people mention double carbon goals. So it's quite effective and productive in China for this policy. President Biden and President Xi will have the virtual meeting next Monday. I think U.S.-China relation is one of the most important bilateral relations in the world. China will seek to coexist with the United States while cooperate with the United States under possible circumstances. Areas of trade, technology, non-traditional security, and culture are the various alternatives for the two countries. However, the U.S. and China have great potentials to turn the bilateral relationship into a multilateral relationship one. Apart from climate cooperation, the two sides could work together to explore the third-party market in African continent. From my perspective, I believe that jointly investing in global infrastructure construction, connecting the Belt and Road Initiative with Build Bank Better, namely B3W, providing alternative for developing countries on infrastructure investment. The two sides may also expand the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank into a global infrastructure investment bank, turning into a wider and more inclusive institution compatible with the current global governance system. So I think in the future, the two countries can work together for the world, not just stuck on the bilateral relationship for our competition or something else. Yeah, as time is limited. This is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have 5 minutes for questions. I apologize to the audience. It's hard to keep the time with such a great panel. And I'm going to tell you now that in 5 minutes, it will just cut off. So you keep your answers as short as you can, because we will simply end at 9:15 American time. So there are many very good questions, but the first one really does go to this question. Right now, we have many global crises, a climate crisis, but also still very much a COVID-19 crisis. What can we do, building on all these ideas, to ensure that the world is vaccinated as fast as possible? The entire world, not just countries' allies, not just the richer countries rather than the poorer countries. What can we do to actually make that happen? The Security Council, I don't think, is the right place. So whoever wants to start, you've got about a minute, but I will open the floor. Yes, please, Mr. Jurgens.
Why don't we first arrange for the mutual recognition of all vaccines already done? I know that Russian vaccine is not certified because Russia does not provide the list of those who tested this vaccine, but it's the question which is purely technical. And then when all vaccines and all new tablets invented, why don't we put a little bit more of the special funds to WHO and start spreading it equally among everybody, with the special access, of course, to the South, which definitely suffers a great deal. In some of the African countries, the schools are closed for 2 years. We lost a whole generation of African kids.
Thank you. So mutual recognition of vaccines, more funds through the WHO with a privileging countries in the global South. Other ideas?
No, just to add to that.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Just to add to that, it's some sort of suspension of the intellectual property restrictions would also help, not only to have more vaccines available, but of course that's the consequence, but to have more production worldwide, distributed in a worldwide way. So that, I think, together with the other things that I have already mentioned, especially more funds to the WHO, would be essential. And no Security Council, no veto power has to be involved in that question. That would be really counterproductive.
Terrific. Thank you.
The whole world the whole world can really be inspired by the example set by the founder of the AstraZeneca, right? Who says, look, I'm doing this for humanity. I don't want a cent out of this, right? As long as everybody benefits, right? Why can't that inspire governments, right? So I hope the government can look at it and see as an example. Another point, and Marie, I would be really sad if the only case for U.S.-China cooperation is just on climate. I mean, you guys are just too big for it. The world needs a lot more from the U.S. than China than just to say, okay, we'll cooperate on climate, but all the other sectors that can make this a better world, you guys are just engaged in rivalries, zero-sum rivalries, right? And meanwhile, you expect the rest of the world to get along, to reconcile, right? Do what you preach to the world, right? Just came off, yeah. So my hope is that the U.S. and China will do a lot more than just cooperate on climate change. There's a whole bunch of issues that can work together, and the whole world is looking for their leadership. Because the G2 solution can be a big part of the G20 and G200 solution that we all expect here.
I think we're going to end there. And indeed, the G stands for global, and we need to be thinking globally. It's not just a matter of morality, it's a matter of collective self-interest. In this case, the two go together. So I'm grateful to all of you for this panel. And I have been taking many notes. This is the kind of thinking we absolutely need. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.